Before the internet, people had television news. Before television news, newsreels. And before newsreels, when people wanted up-to-date visual information about life in America, they had Frank Leslie. For more than 60 years, Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper chronicled life in America through stories and powerful visual images. Yet in many ways, Frank Leslie was even more amazing than anything in these pages. And that story is useless history. When we think about the Civil War, we often remember those iconic Matthew Brady images of death and destruction. But the truth is, during the Civil War, there was no technology that enabled the mass distribution of photographs. So instead, the public image of the war, as well as public events, natural disasters, and many other items, came from printed materials like Leslie's. In fact, even the public image of Matthew Brady came from Leslie's, as he was depicted here in March of 1860. Pictures were printed using a centuries-old technique of hand-carving artwork in reverse onto a block of wood. When the wood was coated with ink and pressed against a sheet of paper, it produced a beautiful, highly detailed image. The results were amazing, but each woodcut could take over a month to engrave. Frank Leslie streamlined the process by having the image painted onto a set of interlocking blocks. The blocks were then broken apart and carved by many different engravers before they were reassembled for printing. It took just as many hours to create an image, but with enough artists, Leslie was able to turn out a newspaper every week. It took an army of reporters, editors, illustrators, typesetters, engravers, and printers, but Frank Leslie had all of these, as well as something few competitors could claim. Frank Leslie had ovaries.
Dateline, Ipswich, England, the 1820s, home to the Carter family, owners of a small but successful glove-making business. Young Henry Carter was destined to take over the family business, but for one small problem. Henry Carter didn't like gloves.
In the 1840s, the London Illustrated News began receiving beautiful, unsolicited engravings from an artist named Frank Leslie. Now, it probably doesn't surprise you to learn that Frank Leslie was in reality the secret identity of 13-year-old Henry Carter, who was trying to hide his artistic interest from his family. And as many people do when they're seeking fame and fortune, Carter moved to New York City. He legally changed his name and started a series of publications. The most successful of these was Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, which began in 1855 and filled its pages with tales of a nation on the verge of civil war. The images were realistic, at times brutal, and they conveyed the emotions of the war in ways that no other technology could. Within a week of any major event, people had a picture. Sometime around 1874, Frank Leslie began an affair with the wife of one of his employees. Originally from New Orleans, Louisiana, Miriam Squire had enjoyed a successful career as an actress. She had passed as a Latin American dancer and was known to have carried on affairs with a number of politicians and writers. Now 38, she left her second husband to marry the glovemaker turned publisher. The couple enjoyed lives of wealth and luxury. They attended parties with presidents and business leaders. For several months, they traveled across the country in a private rail car. They visited major landmarks and discovered the realities of the Wild West. Miriam wrote a best-selling book about the journal, which you can still find online, and is a fun read. But after 6 years of extravagance, the man born as Henry Carter died, and his wife discovered that the business had collapsed. She was now more than $300,000 in debt. It was 1880, and job prospects for a 44-year-old woman were limited. But if Henry Carter could change his name, so could Miriam. Less than a year later, she legally became Frank Leslie, and this is how she signed her letters. She sold jewelry to pay expenses and streamlined the operation into just a few periodicals where she could concentrate the very best artists and writers. Times were difficult and circulation was low, but they kept putting out a fresh edition every week. And then President Garfield was shot. It took 2 months for the popular leader to die, and throughout that time, there was no better source for visually oriented, somewhat sensationalized information than Leslie's newspaper. Circulation went from 30,000 to more than 200,000. The revised newspaper sought out controversy and causes. It was the age of muckrakers and social reformers, and Leslie publications focused on issues of immigration, civil rights, education, and especially women's suffrage. The magazine her husband had run into the ground made the woman known as Frank Leslie very wealthy and very famous. This is a set of paper dolls made in the 1890s celebrating her life. When she died in 1914, she left over $1 million to the women's suffrage movement, enabling the hiring of hundreds of field workers. 6 years later, the 19th Amendment passed, guaranteeing all American women the right to vote. And among the many people who fought for this basic right in a democracy was a woman who understood the importance of being frank. And that's useless history. Oh, by the way, the title of this episode is a reference to the Oscar Wilde play, The Importance of Being Earnest. That's the story of two people who assume the name of Ernest in order to pursue their goals, just as the Leslies both assumed the name of Frank to pursue theirs. Now, we don't know the reason Oscar Wilde chose this title, but it's just possible he was thinking about the Leslies. Because, in addition to being a socialite, a dancer, a publisher, and a women's rights activist, Mrs. Frank Leslie was married to Oscar Wilde's brother.